Good evening. The polls are closing on the East Coast, so we'll go ahead and start right now. Thank you, everybody, for coming, braving the elements, and staying away from your TV sets on Super Tuesday. We're delighted to have you. My name is Laura Heisler. I am the Director of Programming for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation and the Director of Outreach for the Morgridge Institute for Research, two of the three organizations who have combined forces to bring you the Crossroads of Ideas series. Can I get a show of hands for people who have been to other events in this Crossroads series already? So a handful of you. Okay, great. If you haven't already and you would like to get emails from us and aren't already getting emails, we do have a sign-up sheet. We'd love to be in touch with you that way. Just a few words about this series before I turn things over to Brad Schwartz, who will introduce our speaker. This series was really something that we've all been talking about, those of us who work in this building, of putting together for a long time. An event where all three entities in the building, the Wisconsin Institute for Discovery, the Morgridge Institute for Research, and the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, which manages the building and the town center that you're in, we've been talking about having some kind of series that would be emblematic of the spirit that moved everyone to create the Wisconsin Institutes for Discovery building that you're in. And we came up with this one. The building was designed to be a crossroads, both for the campus to talk to itself, to really bridge disciplinary divides, but also to connect the campus and community around issues of our day that matter to people in the community and that are the subject of research by some of the foremost scholars in the world right here on our campus. And so that's what this series is designed to do, to tackle issues that are really pressing, that are on all of our minds. Expect some more things with election-like themes as we get closer to November, and connect with people on campus who are studying these phenomena and these issues, and then bring them to you in this forum. It's meant to be a dialogue, so we'll be having about a 40 to 45-minute lecture each time, and then some time for question and answer. We are taping this session. We'll be archiving all of these lectures on the Discovery website, which is discovery.wis.edu. So that way you can keep up with the series, but also I want to make that point, because if you want to ask a question, it's going to be important for us to get you on the mic. So we'll have mic runners when we get to the Q&A portion. And if you can bear with us and be patient, they're young undergrads, they'll get to you quickly. If you can wait for the mic to ask your question, that would be great. So we really appreciate that. Before I turn things over, I just want to call your attention to the remaining two events for this semester. I neglected to mention this series takes place the first Tuesday of the month. For this year, next year, we're moving it to the second Tuesday. I cleverly thought that would allow us to avoid the election, but I didn't know that the election is only the first Tuesday after the first Monday. Did everybody know that? I think the founding fathers were very cute when they came up with that. I can't think of any reason that it needs to be that way. So that one we will make an exception. Otherwise, it'll be the second Tuesday, and we'll start in September and go through May. So look forward to more next year. But coming up yet this semester, we have tried two other times to bring Cecilia Klingele here to talk about criminal justice reform. She had a medical emergency in November, and then the last time it snowed was on the day we had in mind for Crossroads in February, so we canceled that. Gosh darn it, she's coming, third time's the charm on April 5th. So please look forward to that, and then we will round out the year. Very timely discussion about why democracies need the arts in the current moment in which we find ourselves, with Caroline Levine from the English department. So that's what we have to look forward to. And with that, I will invite Brad Schwartz, the CEO of the Morgridge Institute for Research, to introduce this evening's speaker. Thank you.
Well, greetings, everyone. I'm Brad Schwartz. I'm the director of the Morgridge Institute. And I don't think anybody mistook me for one of the young undergraduates that's going to run around with a microphone. But I want to echo what Laura said. When we started talking about having sessions like this, immediately this idea clearly resonated with everyone that participated in the discussion. Personally, I will tell you that a session like this reminded me of one of the reasons I decided to go into academics. When I was a young undergraduate, a public research university opened my eyes to an environment that I didn't know existed. It was a place where many people from many different backgrounds came together and had fascinating discussions about all sorts of things that were just intrinsically fascinating. And no matter what I did, I found out that I learned important things, and I learned important things that helped me in life. And as time has gone on in the university, and we've all been a little more focused on our specific disciplines, I think that there has been less of this public discussion where we enjoy the fruits of intellectual activity for their own sake. And that's one of the reasons that we decided to have this series. And I think that tonight's speaker, Dietram Scheufele, is going to give us an example of just how rewarding and, in fact, useful such discussions can be. Dietram is the John E. Ross Professor in Science Communication and Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor here at the University of Wisconsin, and he's an affiliate of the Morgridge Institute for Research. Since 2013, he's also held an honorary professorship at the Dresden University of Technology in Germany. Dietram is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Wisconsin Academy of Sciences, Arts and Letters, and a member of the German National Academy of Science and Engineering. As if that weren't enough. He currently is the vice chair of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on the Science of Science Communication, a research agenda. And he also serves on the committee of the National Academies on human gene editing, topics in scientific, medical, and ethical considerations. Dietram has been a tenured faculty member at Cornell. He's been a Shorenstein Fellow at Harvard University and a visiting scholar at the Annenberg Public Policy Center of the University of Pennsylvania. So as we all think about the important issues in society and we think about ways that we can influence them, we're going to learn some very important things from Professor Scheufele today that will help us become more effective at this, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. Dietram.
Thank you. Thank you for that very flattering and exaggerated and dishonest introduction, but I appreciate it nonetheless. I teach a class of about 150 undergrads, maybe 120 this year, and it looks exactly like this, meaning everybody religiously avoids the first row, which I really like. So I feel right at home, and I'm actually going to walk around if that's okay, and ideally a little bit less a televangelist up here, but down here. What I want to talk about in just a few short slides is maybe a little more than a few, but are four different areas that I think matter for what some people might see an anti-science sentiment in the US, but I don't think really is an anti-science sentiment, to just give you the punchline and the answer to that question first. Really quickly, I want to start with, and I will actually start with an election cycle, or with the elections as an example, what we really know about things and what we don't know, and what we actually know we're supposed to know but still refuse to know, and I'll explain that in a second. I want to talk about why we all live in tribes, and that may be more visible right now than it typically is in a time of highly contested, highly partisan primaries. And I want to tell you why I think that matters, that living in tribes, the idea that we're defining ourselves so much by who we are, what we believe in, and what other people don't believe in that we believe in. And then my students often tell me that I'm, and this may be the German heritage, whatever, that I end on really depressing notes, and the world is a horrible place. So I'm going to try and do it differently this time and end on a somewhat more productive and maybe forward-looking note. We'll see how that goes. But let me start with what we know. And I want to show you data that's a little bit older, but it's one of the few times that we actually collected, and when I say we, I mean Tom Patterson and the Kennedy School at Harvard collected data almost from where we are now in the election cycle. So this was in April or so of 2000. This is Bush running against Gore. And every 2 weeks they asked people if they knew, a new sample of Americans, what they knew about issues. And the question here is, do you happen to know whether or not Bush favors a registry for all guns that people own? And even if you don't know the answer to that question, you should be able to guess which Republican candidate would ever favor a gun registry. None of them. So clearly you could guess the correct answer. I plotted in red here over time people who give the wrong answer, who think that he favors that. It's about 1 in 5, and that's actually pretty good, right? So it looks pretty good. The red bars that I put here are the conventions in the summer and the debates. Why? Because those are typically the events where Americans start to learn about candidates, where they start to learn about politics. They get short 30, 90-second answers in the debates or in the conventions, 3 days straight of policy speeches. But before you get too excited about the low number of favors, look at the people who actually know the correct answer. And that's not much better, right? The good news is it starts picking up around the debate time, so people actually start knowing. But on that first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, as we just heard, only 2 in 5 Americans can actually accurately answer that question. And if you plot the people who don't know, you basically have 58, 60%, so roughly 2/3, just under 2/3 of Americans who on election day cannot answer a painfully obvious question about a candidate, one that they should be able to guess. Right? This is where we are. Good news, upside, 40%, 50% of them don't go to vote, so that's the plus, the plus side. But it's really pretty depressing, and for science, it's not that different. Just a couple of years ago, we asked a question in one of our national surveys. Do you think it's true or false that recently the Obama administration banned all research on synthetic biology? So this idea that we merge fields like biology, artificial intelligence, that we can program cells, and so on. And of course, the Obama administration has not done anything that would ban all research, which about 1/3 of Americans know that that's actually false. 2/3 of Americans have no clue. 12% give the wrong answer. The rest of them, at least, are honest enough to say, I don't know. So even in science, and when it comes to science policy, for most things that are coming down the pike, we actually don't know a lot. So that raises in the last question, and that is the US different from the rest of the world? Are we actually different? And I grew up, I did my undergrad in Germany, and then came over here, and so I'm still very surprised. I mean, one of the first things that fascinated me was the idea that you guys sell milk in gallons, that anybody would ever have to buy 4 liters of milk at the same time. So I'm still in a weird spot culturally. But you know, some people are saying, well, the U.S. is just really different. Well, if you ask people if they believe, national surveys, if they believe in the idea of evolution, and this is data from the National Research Council. They have China and Japan. Then they have Europe, which is really a bad way of portraying a lot of different and very diverse set of countries, but you know, it's their data. And then you have the U.S. And you kind of can already see where this is going if you look at the percentages and public buy into evolution. The U.S. just looks different from most other countries. If in fact, in 2006, Science had a great piece where they placed the U.S. just ahead of Turkey and a long list of other countries in public acceptance of evolution. But that's actually an unfair way of looking at these data, or you could construe it as an unfair way. Because you can ask that question in 2 different ways. And if you ask that question in the old way, so this is the original way that I just showed you, this is just a couple years later, or you can ask it by adding that first sentence here, according to the theory of evolution. So this is where that line comes in that I said earlier, right? We know what we're supposed to know, but we refuse to know it anyway, because this is where these data fall. So if I ask you, do you know that you're supposed to know? Do you know that according to the theory of evolution, this is what's going on? The US looks exactly like any other country. It actually fits in perfectly. And that's not a fluke. If you ask it for the Big Bang, you see the exact same thing. Did the universe began with a big explosion? Or do astronomers believe that the universe began with a big explosion? And again, you have that exact same split. And I just want to set up one explanation. There are plenty of explanations for that, but one most striking one, and I'm fully aware that this is an incorrect representation of the US. It's not that the UK covers most of the eastern seaboard down to North Carolina. But for the sake of this graph, let's just assume that's the US, that's the UK, that's France, that's Germany, as some of the big funders of science in Europe. Right? And there's one question that a survey, it's called the World Value Survey. It's done out of the University of Michigan, and they do rotating surveys of 80-some countries in the world. So every 5 years, Germany is in there. Every 5 years, the US is in there. And they asked this question from every single country. How important is God in your life on a 10-point scale between 1 and 10? I mean, 0 obviously being having no faith or no religious beliefs. But basically, where do you score on average? And good survey questions tend to not score at one end or the other. Otherwise, you don't have a scale that has enough range. And for most countries, that works exactly that way. So the UK, roughly, the average population, the average of the overall population, somewhere around 5. right? France, in their post-existentialist ways, a little bit lower. Germany just added, with a reunification, about 20 million people, many of whom are atheists, left over from the communist regime, also kind of same range. US, if you want to guess and pick a number in your head right now, 8.5. So this is everybody from Montana to California to Arkansas to New York, on average, in this country, 8.5 on a 10-point scale. We're a deeply religious country. And that's not good or bad or right or wrong or something that we need to worry about. It's just something that's a reality in terms of how we communicate science and how we ultimately think about science. So let me show you why living in those tribes, some of which defined by some people saying they're highly religious and some people saying they're atheists, some people saying they're Democratic or Democrat, some people saying they're Republican, why that matters. And I want to start by just giving you two reasons. There are plenty of reasons why we live in tribes, but I want to give you two different ones that are really important because they, I think, have a bigger impact on how we think about science than ever before. And the first one is called homophily. And the title basically says it, right, in the picture. We tend to live with people, we tend to interact with people who are just like us. When I first moved back to Madison, I did my PhD here, went off to Cornell, came back. I was asking people about neighborhoods where I could buy a house. And people told me, well, the near West Side, it's really nice. And it was more than once described to me as faculty ghetto. Why is that so important? Because everybody from the near West Side, you will forgive me, I live there, I really like the neighborhood, but the degree of difference between people is the color of their Prius, right? That is about as different as they're gonna get. Everybody else has an Obama yard sign, they have the same kind of dog, and I mean, even the street names are, I live on Rugby Row, I mean, how much more pretentious does it get? But basically, what the important part about homophily is that of course, it shapes our interactions, right? If I'm Facebook friends with certain people, if I talk to my neighbors, I'm not getting a fairly diverse set of political views. I'm getting a very filtered set of political views. And I just want to show you, for the idea of homophily, how that plays out. And if you haven't seen them, the Yelp word maps are I think, really helpful. If you look at Manhattan, for example, and parts of Brooklyn, what are the restaurant reviews that mention the word hipster? And both sides of the Williamsburg Bridge, of course, are the areas where you have the word hipster. Again, birds of a feather flock together. Now, you look for kosher, you're going into Theater District, you're going to Upper East Side. Right? You can already see how people live together and or work together. And the only thing that really unifies New York is hangovers. That's really the only thing that cuts across Brooklyn and all the other boroughs. But that tells you how important homophily is. But homophily, of course, works in our day-to-day settings, but it also works in online settings and in a rapidly changing media system. And when we talk about, and that's the second reason for it, when we talk about a rapidly changing media system, we very often, and I'm in a field of communication, we talk about online and how fundamental a transformation the internet has brought about. And that is correct. But it was actually not the beginning. The transformation of our media system started long before that with cable. And Rachel Maddow, who many of you know, who's an anchor or a host on MSNBC, hosts a fairly liberal talk show. And she'll be the first person to admit that. She gave a talk at the Kennedy School, actually, when I was a fellow there. And in that talk, she basically said, look, what we've done is we've taken a traditional media system and we've sliced it. So you no longer get you can still get broadcast news, evening news, where everybody gets the same, or you can watch Fox News if you're conservative and get your viewpoints from Hannity. Or if you're liberal, you can listen to Rachel Maddow and get your viewpoints from her. And you'll never be upset because you only hear what you want to hear. And so we're slicing, and we started this with cable, we're slicing this in ways where we're giving audiences, all of us, what we already know and want to know. And here's the critical part, that's where we're making money right now. All the traditional media, newspapers, a lot of broadcasters losing money, is cutting back, cutting correspondence because they can't afford to anymore. The gold mine is opinionated media. So this is where it started, and the internet was just a logical consequence. Oops. And it was just a logical consequence, and it was a logical consequence because of the importance that social media are playing. This is data from Pew that shows you people's news use patterns. So these are people that use Facebook and Twitter, that use social media for news. And the changes between 2013 and 2015 are staggering. So what you have among internet users, large majorities now that use social media for news. So that used to be broadcast, it used to be newspapers, now are social media. And there's social media, if you look here at the bottom, that we even use to follow breaking events. And if you remember this tweet, the very first piece of news that we ever heard about Navy SEALs going in and in an operation to eventually kill Osama bin Laden was actually a tweet by a guy in Pakistan. So this is really weird. There's a bunch of helicopters hovering over the compound. And he didn't even know what he was tweeting about. But that turned out to be the very first news item about this event, right? So this is the world we live in. Put this together with slicing news further. Two things. One, algorithms as editors. So if I'm a newspaper, traditionally what I did is I print a paper, I put it out, and I hope people are interested. Now, I post articles online. But if I'm the New York Times, before I go into print on Sunday for the Sunday Times, I post them on Friday. By the time I have to go in print, I already know what the popular stories are, how deeply people clicked into the story. I know which stories to emphasize, not to emphasize, which ones to run, which ones not to run. So the idea that we make editorial choices based on algorithms has huge implications because it allows me to basically target stories toward particular audiences. And I keep telling my students this, I don't care about baseball. This is the second thing I'm saying that it's going to alienate people, but I don't care. I don't understand it, never followed a game, it's a boring sport, no offense. Instead, I watch a really mediocre soccer team from Stuttgart, which is equally boring, so it's all good. But there's absolutely no reason why any news organization should, if I look at my tablet, give me a baseball story. Because I'm going to immediately leave that news site. I'm not going to read it. I'm going to go somewhere else and read it. It makes no commercial sense, right? So slicing the audience into interests actually makes a lot of commercial sense. And of course, we have this very development on social media, where we very often talk, and the term narrowcasting is, of course, a wordplay on broadcasting, right? It used to be that we have one news organization broadcasting to the audience. Now we have a lot of different viewpoints, but we narrowcast them and select them toward every single one of you in this room. If two people in this room have the exact same friends on Facebook, not the same number, but the same friends, you will get a different feed. Why? Because at some point, 2 o'clock in the morning, you look through a bunch of pictures and click through them of that other person, and your algorithm has forever changed. Because you're interested, because you purchase certain things on Amazon, and that data gets fed in. So in other words, now the holy grail of media is to target information toward you as a person. Loop all the way back to tribes, right? I will only get, or I'm predominantly get what I already believe in. Either because the New York Times is picking that based on my own patterns of what I clicked on and what I've read in the last 2, 3, 4 years, or because of social media, and because of homophily on social media, because your Facebook friends are exactly like you. If they all get upset at Donald Trump, you're probably a Democrat if all your friends get upset. And if vice versa, if they don't, you're probably Republican, because that's how our networks tend to play out. So this is how then basically blogs look like, what the world looks like in the online world. You have a bunch of red blogs and websites and things talking to each other. You have a bunch of blue ones talking to each other, and you have very little crosstalk. And ultimately, what comes out of that, so if those are the two reasons, one of the first problems that we have is as a result that our tribes become more and more refined. And I just want to show you some data here really quickly. This is, again, from the Pew Research Center, data where we used to have in 1994, so this is the Republican Revolution, if you remember, then 2004. This is when Bush runs for re-election. Not by convincing anybody that wars are a great idea, but or that his approval ratings are really better than they are, but by turning out 9 million people in Ohio and Florida who hadn't voted before, by convincing them that there's a culture war going on. But even then, we don't really have a lot of split yet, right? We have two normal curves for the Democrats, for the Republicans. In 2014, not only do we have normal curves, not have normal curves anymore, they're now piled up to the left and to the right, but the median is moving further and further apart. And that may be bad, but it gets worse. And it gets worse if you ask people, you have about a third of Democrats and a third or a little bit more of Republicans who have strong, unfavorable views toward the other party. So it's not just that we disagree, we hold unfavorable views. And here's the kicker. A quarter or a third of each party are convinced that the other one is out to destroy America. So when you ask them, are people from the other party a threat to the nation's well-being? If we're Democrats, a quarter of us are convinced that Republicans are bad. And if we're Republicans, a third of us is convinced that Democrats are actually bad for the nation's well-being. This is where we're now, and this is where the tribal kind of separation has really gotten us. And it's, as you can see, it's gotten worse in both parties, almost at the same rate. So that's outcome number one. That's really problematic. But that's particularly problematic because our social environment and the tribe that we think we belong to really shapes how we act and how we behave, right? And we know this from social psychology for a long time. You've all seen this in social studies class. At some point, the now infamous or famous Solomon Asch experiments. And what he did basically, just to refresh your memory, he did experiments with, and these are really all mostly males, well, all males in his experiments actually. But really the only person in this experiment who's being experimented on is this guy. Everybody else is a Confederate. And the question that he's being asked, that everybody is being asked, is which one of these lines, A, B, or C, is of equal length to X? Right? So and here's the important part, it's something that's factually clear. It's not something like, are you in favor or against abortion? Do you believe in God or not? Those are questions that have an opinion, a moral, a belief component. This one is actually a factual question. Which one is the correct length? And what ended up happening is, they go around the room and all these people give the wrong answer, and then this person who already looks pretty surprised, you can already tell that he's really thrown off, basically in 7 out of 10 cases also gives the wrong answer, simply because the tribe that he's been thrown into is telling him that that's the incorrect answer. Right? 7 out of 10 will actually do this. And when you ask them after the surveys, and here's again his facial expression, right? If you ask them, you basically express what it's like to not belong. They're basically saying it's deeply unpleasant to not belong. And it's really hard to go in opposition. It's not about right or wrong. It's not about facts. And take this in the realm of science, right? It's not about what's right or wrong, what I know to be right or wrong. It's about where I belong. And it's about the pleasure or the lack thereof, this uneasy feeling that makes it so difficult. Now, the one thing, and Brad and I talked about this briefly before the talk, there's an upside to this. And the upside is that we can actually use this for really good environmental campaigns. And a guy named Robert Cialdini, who used to be a faculty member at Arizona State, then retired and made a lot of money in private industry selling exactly this to hotel chains, basically did research where he manipulated these hang tags that you've seen in hotel rooms that tell you to not throw your towels on the floor, but to put them back on the rack, and therefore you help the environment. And so this was condition number one, where they basically gave you this generic hang tag, and about a third of people actually put their towels back. And I fully admit I'm not one of them. I'm in a hotel room, I'm lazy, I just leave it on the floor. Horrible behavior, but I'm one of the 2/3. That's the way it is. Well, then what they ended up doing, they made a slight wording change on that thing, and they said 75% of the people in this room actually do reuse their towels. And all of a sudden, 44% actually changed their behavior. This is in real studies in hotels, right? And then the last one, 75% of the people in this very room, they stood on these tiles in room 207, recycled. 50%. So, of course, there's a slight ethical dilemma there, right? That 75% is a total straight-up lie, right? Because even in the best case scenario, it's 50, but that's a different issue. Just wanted to point that out. But those mechanisms work also, in favor of other people, of certain outcomes. But the third outcome that I think is really important, that our values and the values within the tribe very often end up replacing information. And they end up replacing information for reasons that I think make a lot of rational sense. And some of you will have seen me use that slide before. It's really based on a very simple, two very simple principles, why we're using values. It's actually not a bad thing. It's something that we do, all of us do. By the time you've gotten here, you've made thousands of decisions today, many of which you don't even remember. Every single person you've met here today, who you haven't met before, you made a judgment if that person is going to stab you or mug you. You did. You're going to say, no, I didn't. Yes, you did. You made a judgment if that is a dangerous person. You did. You do that all the time, right? You constantly scan your environment. All of us do. And so we make these decisions, basically, in most cases, you already formed a judgment the moment I walked up. Based on what I wear, based on my accent, based on a whole bunch of things, you formed a judgment. And so did I when I look at you, right? We all do. We do that all the time. And it's called being cognitive misers. We use as little information as we think we can get away with to make any given decision, period. All of us do. And if we did not, and this is the second part, we would shut down about 3 minutes into our day because of cognitive overload. Because you cannot think through every decision in all its consequences, and with all available facts. So this is us every day, right? We're juggling 50,000 different things, and then, oh, by the way, what's your stance on human gene editing? I don't care. This is not a problem right now that I'm ready to deal with or that I have cognitive capacity for. But I am being asked to make judgments all the time in the absence of full information. Every single person in this room has a view on Obamacare. Not a single person in his room has read the 1,000 pages that went to the Affordable Care Act. And if you have, raise your hand right now and tell me that I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. I haven't read it. I feel very strongly about it. And people in Congress have admitted voting on it without having read 1,000 pages. So we use replacements. We all do all the time. And values are just one example. And I want to show you a study that we did that got us yelled at by both ends of two different tribes, highly religious people and atheists. So that is always a sign of success if you get yelled at by both sides, I think. Basically what we did, and it's much more complicated than the graph that I'm showing you here, but we compared the top funders of nanotechnology. So this technology that came up in early 2000, late 1990s, modifications at the molecular scale, 1 to 100 nanometers with a nanometer being a billionth of a meter. Lots of countries investing, Germany included, a whole bunch of European countries. US under Bush 43 more than quadrupled funding for nanotechnology. Lots of research on the UW campus and in this building actually as well. And what we looked at is at the country level. We used that question earlier, remember that 10-point scale? And we placed each of these countries where they fall in that 10-point scale. And then we also used data from our national surveys and from the Eurobarometer that had all asked the question, is nanotechnology making modifications, creating new materials that don't exist in nature, is that morally acceptable? And then we simply plotted, for the sake of simplicity here, we plotted them on this grid, right? And the more religious the climate is in this country, the lower your scores go for nanotechnology being morally acceptable. You can control out how scientifically literate the public is, you control out a whole bunch of things. Ultimately, the climate of the values in a country will shape some of the thinking about new technologies. So that just as a starter of why values matter and why they matter across different cultures. But more importantly, values matter not just because we use them as a replacement, and we all do, right? Being religious or being atheist are somewhat comparable value systems in many ways. They're both very strong beliefs about how the world works or doesn't work. But it's not just that they serve as a replacement, meaning if I'm highly religious, I may oppose certain technologies. They also, for all of us, every single one of us in this room, shape how we look at what should be objective information. And that's really where it becomes problematic or really problematic for science. And the idea, sorry for clicking over this too quickly, the idea goes back to motivated reasoning. And I always put these two images here because as somebody who grew up in Germany, I'm always absolutely fascinated by how quickly you guys pull out the Hitler comparisons. And you know, Bush was Hitler, Obama was Hitler. I mean, it's one for healthcare, the other one for, I can't remember what that one was at the time. But it's clearly the exact same thing means very different things to different people. And we know this from psychology. It's called motivated reasoning. And motivated reasoning is something that we all engage in. It says basically, it doesn't say that you only look at information that interests you. That's selective perception. We all do that too. But what it says is, if I put 10 facts in front of you right now, and I say, make a decision based on those facts, you will weigh more heavily those facts that fit your prior beliefs, your values. And you will weigh less heavily those that are inconsistent with your values. So in other words, you reevaluate objective evidence to fit your belief system. All of us do. And it's called confirmation or disconfirmation biases, right? A confirmation bias means I weigh something more heavily because it fits what I already believe in. And ultimately, the goal is what's called biased assimilation, meaning I take the reality and adjust it to what I already believe. And again, that's just how we function. There are ways around that, but they're somewhat limited. But more importantly, if we like it or not, scientific information, the same piece of information, means different things to different people. And I just want to show you two examples. One I've used before, but I wanted to put it in here again because there was a lot of, I think, surprise when we had some of the recent budget cuts, and some of them affected the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And I think responses from within the university were, how do people not get how important this is for the state? And we actually had a survey, a Wisconsin-wide survey, a Badger poll that we did, where we looked at the potential economic benefits that people saw from biofuels. And if they're above zero, they see positive net effects for the state. And if they're below zero, they see negative net effects. And then we looked at what happens as they take in more information. So as more facts become available, what happens? Do people become more or less positive? Right? And you see the four groups that we had, Democrats, Republicans, the two ideologically separated tribes, and then different informational intake. Here are your Democrats. The more they find out, the happier they are and the more excited they are about economic potential. Here's your Republicans. Exactly the opposite. None of them is right or wrong. What I mean by that is they take the exact same information and interpret it in different ways. And the exact same information means different things to different people. Let me give you an even more striking example. This is Brandon Nyhan has done this, and I'll walk you through this at Dartmouth. And he basically looked at three groups of parents who were very open to vaccinating their children. And on the y-axis, you see the percentage of them willing to vaccinate. People kind of on the fence, and people who are opposed to vaccinating their children, or at least are most negative. Not opposed, but most negative. You see that much lower here. And then he put them in experimental conditions. He gave them a whole bunch of interventions. So this is on the left, you have the control, they get nothing. Then they get a correction, which is the give them facts that prove them wrong. And then they had a narrative condition, a risk condition, images. Let's ignore that for now. The one thing that you should look at is this, and compare it to the control. So what happened here? In the control, these people are not super excited about vaccinating their children. They get nothing, right? They're at about, where are they, 70-some%. If I go in and I tell them why they're wrong, and I wag my finger and say, this is why you're wrong, and here's all the facts that are wrong about your decision, they become even more negative. They dig in. And again, compared to all the other conditions, we just made a bad situation worse by basically going on saying, here, I'm feeding you all the facts, and how do you not know any better? And what happens is, well, you know what? That's my prior belief. Again, I'm taking my prior beliefs, and I'm engaging in motivated reasoning, and I'm filtering it through that. And me simply going out and being an academic about things is simply not working out. Again, for everybody else, really high rates, right? Even here we have higher rates. The one where we don't get anything, or where we get actually negative effects, is the fact-based, only fact-based intervention. So there are some real downsides to basically taking our very knee-jerk academic approach and trying to prove people wrong. So let me give you a few thoughts, and I told you I would hopefully try and save this and make it a slightly more positive outlook here at the end. But before I get there, it's going to get worse. It will. So if we like it or not, I mean, this is where we are, right? Stem cell research, classic tribally defined issue across party lines, with very few exceptions. You have people like Tommy Thompson certainly here was an exception. You have Orrin Hatch out of Utah, an exception. But other than that, it falls very often along partisan lines, and Michael J. Fox doing ads here in Wisconsin and Missouri, elsewhere, that many of you have seen. Climate change. Bob Inglis, I'm not sure if you remember him, congressman from South Carolina, who made the mistake at some point 6 years in to believe in climate change. And he did that just as he was being challenged by a Tea Party candidate, lost his primary in South Carolina, and got kicked out of Congress because he did not fall with the tribe. And he just spoke, actually, Brad mentioned the Science of Science Communication National Academies Committee. I just came back from it last week, and he spoke to our committee describing some of his experiences, and in particular the role that Al Gore initially played in promoting his very partisan and tribal thinking, and I'll get back to that in a second. Even obesity. Michelle Obama made the mistake at some point of suggesting that maybe our school children could eat meals that are slightly more nutritious and more healthy than when we categorized ketchup as a vegetable, and immediately got into deep trouble. And actually, Chris Christie and Mike Huckabee came to her defense, both of whom, of course, have struggled with being overweight, and said, look, this should not be an issue that breaks down by partisan lines. Synthetic biology, or gene editing, when J. Craig Venter in 2010 put synthetic DNA into a live bacterial cell, and what he called created life in a lab, immediately you saw the religious fault lines coming out. For obvious reasons, GMOs, very similar, and then germline editing, the human germline editing in particular. Most recently, I think you've seen a mitochondrial report coming out of the NRC, so having DNA from 3 parents going into an embryo, as at least that's how a lot of media coverage framed it. But again, one that will fall very nicely into the committee that I'm on is looking at some of those fault lines. Let me go back to the Al Gore example really quickly, because I just to illustrate our tribal thinking and how we got there. I think there are a lot of people at Wisconsin who do unbelievably good research, and all over the country for that matter, on A, climate change, and B, how to better communicate it. But we've kind of accepted where we are in climate change as if that was a given, and it wasn't a given. And I just want to remind you of the 2000 election, especially for those of you who weren't around for that election. Right? So this was an election where on election night we called the election 2 different ways, for Bush and for Gore, and then basically said, oh, we can't call it yet, hold on. And what ended up happening is that Florida became a really important state, right? And Gore basically said, look, I want to recount. Remember let me just put this up here. Remember that ballad, right? The now infamous butterfly ballad with the hanging chads and people looking and recounting. And Bush barely hanging on to a lead in Florida. As it turned out later, if you remember, Bush lost the popular vote but won the electoral vote. Gore took this to the Florida Supreme Court. He sued in front of the Florida Supreme Court, then took it to the US Supreme Court. And depending on where you are on the which side of the political aisle you're on, you either thought that the Supreme Court handed the election to whoever they shouldn't they stole the election for the Republicans, or you believe that Gore tried to steal the election from the Republicans, depending on, again, what your views are. And that's exactly, if you look at it, that's exactly what happened, right? You have the sore losermen, the crying towels, and so on and so forth after the election. So rewind to 2000, and now think climate change. This is the person who we now make the spokesperson of climate change. This person becomes the face of climate change. Well, extremely well-meaning, right? He wants to do the right thing. But after 2000, this is what we do. And so what I did here, I took Gallup data that goes back a little bit further, but I just took that election cycle, bringing us full circle to the very beginning of where I started. And asking people, do you think that the severity of the problem of climate change is exaggerated? And to just show you the graph over time. So right, we're about a third, and then we kind of little blips, and then we go up, and we kind of stay much higher. So we have a good chunk of the American public who continue to think that when we talk about climate change, we're exaggerating the problem. Let me give you a few events. This is the day after tomorrow, so somewhat unrelated. But this is where Gore comes in, an inconvenient truth, right? The 1.5-hour movie PowerPoint. Next one, now we're attaching, and Bob Inglis talks about this very eloquently. Now, the US doesn't like being told by any international body what to do, Democrats or Republicans, but certainly not Republicans. And all of a sudden, now we're giving the IPCC and Gore a Nobel Prize. The Norwegians do. And then we give him an Oscar. Liberal Hollywood gives him an Oscar. And then he gets a Grammy for the best audiobook. And then we're going up to Cancun. So the more we talk, the more people think we're exaggerating the problem. At least a chunk of the public who does not think that Al Gore is a very good spokesperson, because for them, that's still the guy who tried to sue in order to win the election. So what does that mean then? Where does that leave us? It leaves us here. This is Views on Climate Change, great study out of Maine. And they basically plotted 3 groups: Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And then what's the probability of any respondent believing that climate change is man-made? Down here, and this is the really cool part about this study, down here what they did is they went after every respondent and geocoded where he or she lived and where she was interviewed. And then basically coded, was it at the place where they were the day of the interview? Was it unseasonably cold or warm? So the warmer it is, this is temperatures above the average that it should be. So if today, we have, a 72-degree day out there, this would be unseasonably warm, right? And we'd be somewhere up, well, not 12 degrees, it would be a lot higher. Or is it unseasonably cold? So conclusion, what did we get out of climate change communication since then? We got Democrats being convinced that climate change is real. Gore said it. We have Republicans convinced that climate change isn't real. Gore said it. And we have independents in between who are oscillating either between Gore was right if it's really warm, or Gore was wrong if it's really cold, right? So they're basically torn between the 2 poles depending on how unseasonably warm or cold it is. That's where we are in climate change. And so let me just end with one last slide, well, maybe 2 last slides. And sorry for that looking a little bit Snapchatty-ish, that picture, but the quote didn't show, right? That was a few days ago, right? Leonardo DiCaprio finally gets his Oscar. We're all happy for him because he really was lacking in his life, not having an Oscar. But more importantly, he gets up and uses the platform to basically tell people climate change is real. It's happening right now. Because that's going to help that one half who already is really pissed off about Gore to believe in climate change. The fact that liberal Hollywood is now coming and wagging their fingers at them as well. So that's approach number 1. Approach number 2, and I'm not sure how many of you saw this, was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I don't typically align myself on messaging with Arnold Schwarzenegger, even though geographically we grew up in, not that far apart. But he basically wrote this column that said, I don't give an F if you agree about climate change or not. I don't have to be right. But you do have to agree with me that if you live in Phoenix, Arizona, in the 6th largest city of the US, and sometimes in the summer, planes cannot take all the luggage because the tarmac gets so hot that they can't take off if they're too heavy, you need to agree with me that we need to put solar panels on every house. It just makes no sense to not do that, right? And so his approach is, the moment you mention climate change, you trigger tribes. You start sorting into tribes. The moment you have to be right about climate change, you reinforce an already existing division. And so now this is really the last slide. This is where I think Mitt Romney was right on in before the 2008 election, before he was forced into a highly polarized field. He basically said 2 things about renewable energies. Number 1 is global competitiveness. In 10 years, that's his basic line, and Schwarzenegger buys into the same. In 10 years, China will have to buy green energy somewhere. If you followed any of the reports out of Beijing, and respiratory problems, smog beyond imagination, they will have to buy green energy. Are they going to buy it from the Germans, who have invested in this for decades and are really ready to sell into a 1 billion people market, or they're going to buy it from us because we have invested in it? Climate change, what's climate change? I don't know. I'm talking about global competitiveness. I'm talking about selling American technology to China. So that's number 1. Number 2 is energy independence. Do you want to send your children to a war in countries that you can't accurately place on a map, that you don't know how to pronounce? Or do you want energy independence? And fracking will kind of get us there, but we will have to invest in other energies. Those were the 2 key messages. What is the outcome? Do I have to be right about climate change? I don't have to be right about climate change. Do I have to, at the end, be there and go like, see, I told you all along? I'd rather not stand there in the end and tell you I was right all along. What I do want, and this is the 3rd time that I'm going to offend people in this room, I would like for fewer people to drive this kind of car. And until a few months ago, I drove a big pickup truck, so I'm the last person who should throw any stones. I'm sitting in a gigantic glass house. But basically, that's the outcome. right? That is what we want to achieve. We want to have more energy efficiency. We want to have more energy independence. Do we have to be right about climate change? A, we don't, and that's the whole Schwarzenegger point. But number two, if we insist on being right, we're just going to reinforce the tribes and the separation into groups where every piece of messaging, I showed you the one on bioenergy, on biofuels, where even on vaccinations, where it's about children, even then we dig in because we're being challenged in what we so deeply believe in. So ultimately the solution, and this is my attempt at a slightly positive outlook here at the end, the solution for climate change is actually a really good model. It is about outcomes, and it's about values that end up uniting us rather than values that end up separating us. And me telling you that you're wrong and that science was always right is a value that separates us. That doesn't take away from the importance of getting facts out. That doesn't take away from the importance of informing the public and policymakers about the facts of climate change. It's crucially important. But in order to get certain policy buy-in from both sides, I think we need to go well beyond that, and I think we need to really start paying attention to what we know from psychology, from communication, from social science more broadly about how to build better science-public interfaces. And I'm going to leave it at that and hope that I didn't go too far over time. Thank you so much. Do I call on people, or do you guys decide by handing microphones out? Either way. Harvey.
Just with respect to one area that you didn't mention, cigarette smoking. Surgeon General's report in 1960s, a drumbeat of health messages on the cigarette packages, fact after fact after fact. Cigarette smoking has declined dramatically. I think it's now around 20% from about almost being universal. Can you explain that? Because it does not seem to fit in with a values-oriented approach that you're mentioning.
I think it fits in actually extremely well with the social norms, which is what those towel studies were all about, right? So the idea that what we forced cigarette companies to do, and cigarette smoking is complicated because it has an addiction element to it as well, right? So it's not just a decision where I'm like, oh, so today I'm going to give up smoking because there's all the facts about that. So I think there are complicating factors in there, but there's, of course, I think you're absolutely right. I think there were lots of facts. If those changed public opinion, I've seen much less evidence on that. I think there are two pieces of evidence. One is what's in communication called cultivation research. So the idea of what we think the world around us looks like depends heavily on our exposure to entertainment media. And they first found that link when they looked at how much time you spent watching television and how likely you thought you would be the victim of a violent crime. And there's a direct correlation. It's not watching news, it's watching entertainment television and then thinking you're going to get stabbed or killed or whatever else. Well, why is that? Because most of us don't regularly see people get stabbed or killed. So our take on our views on what the world looks like comes from cultivation. How often people smoke. Who smokes? The good characters, the bad characters. So what is normal, what is acceptable behavior is very, very different. And then number two, that becomes a social norms problem, right? So can I actually change with a truth campaign or whatever else the norms of the perceptions of what the normal behavior is? And we do that on college campuses all the time with anti-binge drinking campaigns where we try to convince undergrads that all the other undergrads don't actually drink, so you shouldn't drink either. That's the social norm. And the very last episodic pieces, I spent some time every so often over in Dresden teaching, and I promise you the social norms are very different. Every faculty member and every student and every postdoc is standing right outside smoking a cigarette. It's just a very different set of cultural norms. They have the exact same information available that we have here. It's just a matter of culture. And so I think for smoking, it's much more about norms and cultivated beliefs than it is about facts. And it has the addiction element as a complicant. There was somebody at the very first in the very back there. Oh, or if we go there first, yeah.
You talked about media use, impact, and changes. Could you talk about generational differences in how this works? So
I think the biggest generational difference, and for the sake of time, I didn't put them in there, but so we track different news diets over time and actually slice them by age cohorts. And you see basically the biggest proportion of older viewers, of older audiences in traditional only diets, so people who watch television, who read newspapers, and so on. The more you switch over to an online only diet, the younger the audiences get. My students see me as old now, so I can talk about this way. We just did a short little attendance quiz and what scientists look like, and they said old, over 40. So this is really the sad part. But what ends up happening is the more you go to younger audiences, the more they have online only diets. But that actually is indicative, yes, of a pattern, but B, more importantly, of the willingness to pay. And I think this is where our problem comes in. The fact that everybody who is under 25 right now assumes that news is free, period. You use Feedly maybe and get it there, or Flipbook or whatever else, but you don't have a subscription. You don't traditionally pay for news. But news is not free, right? For-pay journalism is expensive. Corey Dean just spoke to our committee from the New York Times, and basically her point is, look, we don't have a business model. And she didn't say it that way. She's actually very modest. But what came through was, I'm famous enough to not care because I will still sell books, but everybody after me will have to care because we no longer have a business model that works. And the two business models, we talked about this in my class this morning, that we have is The Economist, which means I charge a lot of money and I slice off a good chunk of the bottom end of the distribution as far as income and education and everything else is concerned, right? I make news for the ones who actually don't need it because they already are extremely information rich and fiscally rich. That's one business model that works really well. And then the other one is the UK Daily Mail, 40 million unique hits, no news, bunch of skin, naked people, and it's all about hit rates. Those are the two business models that work. So I think the problem that we're dealing with is that what used to be translators of science, people who used to take 20 years of research, highly complicated research, or gene editing research, and say, this is why you should care, and here are the policy options, and in 300 words. Those are the people who are no longer employed. Barnaby Fader left the New York Times. Ken Weiss left the LA Times, the Washington Post. Who else? Dan Vergano left USA Today. Miles O'Brien and his whole staff got laid off from CNN, the whole science staff. The New York Times closed their green blog and the environmental desk. So we're really seeing that go away because there's just no business model there right now. And I think that's not going to get better anytime soon. So I did manage to end up on a depressing note after all. So thank you for that. Thank you for that question.
Hi, I'm wondering about the priming effect. I'm sure read about studies where young women will do more poorly on math tests if they're reminded of the fact that they are female and they're taking a test in math. More recently, a study showed that students who are of a religious background will do more poorly on a science test if reminded of the fact that they are religious and it's a test about science, than if they're not reminded that they're religious and just told it's a test about something generic. And I wonder if we can draw any lessons from that about
Sure.
anything.
Yeah, so two things about priming. One is there's actually been a whole bunch of critical voices of priming research, especially in psychology, and I'm blanking on his John Bark, I think is his name. His first name is John, I think, but it's definitely Bark is his last name at NYU. So he did these priming experiments where what he did is he basically showed people pictures of old people and then measured and then said, hey, by the way, in order to complete the experiment, can you walk down to the copier and pick up a thing? And then basically people started walking more slowly as if they had been primed with age. Well, turns out that wasn't double-blind, and actually his grad assistants knew what they wanted to find out, and so it was an observer effect. So the grad students actually wanted to see, slower-paced walking for these people, and it couldn't be replicated anywhere. So some of those priming studies, I think, are beginning to be criticized for good reasons. But the reason why I put this up, this is straight-up priming. That green line is priming, meaning priming means your attitudes depend on the considerations that are most easily retrievable from memory at the time you make a decision. And we have this in survey research all the time, right? If I ask you about what is your stance on the death penalty, and I put you in a condition where I just ask you about Oklahoma City bombing and Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma and the Unabomber and whatever else, your support for the death penalty will actually go up. So what you think is a stable attitude is actually an attitude that can be primed. The green line, straight up priming. Meaning if I make salient at the time of the interview, the fact that it's warm outside, your attitude toward climate change will change. So that green line is actually a really good example, a really good application of priming. And typically when I use that slide, I use it as a priming example. It just also really nicely shows the partisan split, which is why I used it. So, but I think it's an important theory. I've actually written about it in PNAS in a piece in 2014 about science communication as political communication and pointed that out. I think you're right on as far as how important it is. Yeah.
Thank you. This is really interesting. I wanted to push back a little bit on what you were saying about social media, though. I spent a year working for Upworthy, which is a social media news company with 30 million some viewers, and the sort of central mission of it was about and against this idea of the filter bubble. And so there were a lot of specific things done all of the time in order to try to make material appeal to people across the divide. And so I think that you can actually see that if you look at some of the ways in which research on millennials, who are sort of the prime consumers of social media, are portraying themselves and understanding themselves according to different categories. And in fact, they're refuting a lot of them. I think many of them say that they believe in God, but they don't align themselves with a particular religion. The Democrat and Republican end of the spectrum is something that I think people are turning away from, and you can see that in some ways with like the decision around gay marriage, which had this huge swell of support across sort of a surprising spectrum. So in a way, it's just sort of complicating one sector of the group of people that you're talking about, but that social media doesn't always necessarily have to have this kind of very divisive effect, and because of course it's also making possible a lot of different kinds of voices. So that you're hearing from this, it's quite a cacophony.
And so, I mean, I think there's 2 points in that are both well taken. I think number one, social media is not social media, right? And I think BuzzFeed is another really good example of an organization that has taken the lists of 15 ways to break up with your boyfriend, girlfriend lists that are really clickbait, but mostly. But then taken the profits from that and hired a lineup of science writers that are just truly impressive, from Dan Vergano, who used to be at USA Today and elsewhere, and I think are doing really good long-form science journalism financed indirectly by that. So I think that's your first point. That's very well taken, that there are different ways of slicing that, and that Facebook is one thing, and others, and BuzzFeed maybe something else. And but I think the second thing is, and this is, I'm not sure that's an empirical question, and I'm not sure I fully agree with you. So yes, we have cohorts that are growing up with different set of prior beliefs. So they may be very open to things like gay marriage. To which degree that means they have a Facebook feed that's full of people who are pro-gay marriage and constantly interact with the other side. I'm not so sure if that's true, right? So I do think that we're seeing groups with different sets of priors, and that partisanship may be less and less important, and people have argued that. The Research Foundation has argued that religiosity is actually becoming less important as a value in the US as a prior, but it'll be replaced by other priors. So that, I think, is more of an open question, but I agree with you that we'll see different sets of tribes emerging. There's a very last thing on that. There's actually a really interesting study or a really interesting algorithm that a bunch of Italian computer scientists wrote about in the MIT Technology Review, which is the anti-Facebook Google algorithm, meaning they figure out what you really believe in and then they feed you the opposite, right? And that's a cute idea. It's great in many ways, except for it makes zero business sense, right? So this is give Dietram baseball news, and do that, and I will go somewhere else. I promise you that. And the same thing is true for all of us. If I constantly feed you news that you're not interested in, or that you have shown me through your patterns that you're not interested in, you will go somewhere else. And we don't have the well-paid public television system or public media system that other countries have. So we have a commercial model, if we like it or not. But I think both very well taken points. I mean, I was told that I can take 2 more questions, but I talk too much, so I probably need to give short answers. Yeah.
You gave us an example of how you can step aside from the partisanship and create a new way of looking at an issue with climate change, at least by talking about global competitiveness or talking about energy independence. Does a sideline like that exist, though, for issues like stem cells or modifying the human genome, where perhaps it's not so much economic or political as it is ethical or moral?
Stem cells are a really good example. So when Bush 43 implemented the federal funding guidelines for stem cell research, it actually helped us here quite a bit, right? Because we owned a bunch of the lines. But California wasn't so happy, and the UC system wasn't happy at all, and basically started Prop 7, what was at the time Prop 71, to raise private money for stem cell research to work around the Bush funding guidelines. And they sent Brad Pitt out as their spokesperson. New movie went to all the talk shows and basically said, hey, I want to talk about Prop 71, and I want to talk about Prop 71 because it's going to push the boundary of medicine for California, 8th largest economy in the world, right? And it's basically social progress, and it will produce a huge influx of industry into, and especially stem cell-based industries into California. So it will have economic impact. Basically saying, look, I know your religious concerns. I can't address them, right? I mean, especially for embryonic. I can't tell you we're not going to use embryos for embryonic stem cell research. Maybe down the road we won't. But I can tell you two values that you will care about. And one is pushing the frontiers of science and of medicine, and the other one is the economy. And Orrin Hatch is a great example of somebody who, from his religious perspective, is completely opposed to stem cell research, but from a medical perspective and a hope for cures is completely on board. Now, is that hyped? Is that whatever else? That's a different question. But there are ways of communicating, even for stem cell, around those core values, because ultimately it's all a value trade-off, right? I may care about this, and I like my pickup truck a lot. It's an awesome truck. But there may be some other considerations that outweigh that at that moment, and so that become a better heuristic or a shortcut if it's being offered to me. And I think for stem cell, that's already noticeable. For gene editing, it's such a multi-layered problem that I think we'll have multiple discussions. I mean, if we're talking about, are we using it, is it a function of, or is it a matter of embryonic research? That's one front line. Is it changing out the human genome with gene drives once they're available for mammals? So we basically switch out the human genomes in 20 generations? Do we want that? Do you want genetically modified humans? I think that a whole bunch of different ones with different sets of values. So that's a much more complicated issue, but I think that is going to be the big issue of our time. I mean, scientifically, for us, next 20 years, the idea of human gene editing is going to be the one that will dominate everything, one way or the other. Do you have time for one more? Is there one more? Okay.
Do you have any advice for scientists as to how we can present information to the public that will prevent further tribe splitting? Because I'm not even an official scientist yet. I'm just an undergrad. But as soon as people find out that I'm a genetics major, they ask me all these questions about like cloning and IVF and GMO. And it's either they're asking me questions to confirm what they already believe, or they know nothing about it and they just want a yes or no.
Yeah.
And no matter how many times I say it's something that you have to figure out, or there's pros and cons to everything, they'll still come back with like, but really, and can't you just tell me? And
yeah, so I think there are two things, right? One of the very first conversations I've had at Wisconsin when I came back here was with somebody in the Nelson Institute who will remain unnamed. But I was basically making the argument for better science communication and why that's really important for some of these really controversial issues. And it was a he, so I'll narrow it down that way. Butch in the scientific community doesn't do much, but but he basically came back and said, oh no, in the end, good science, when the dust settles, good science is always going to win. And the answer is, well, A, that's very optimistic, and B, it's probably wrong. But what that means is there are two things that are really important. One is to avoid pitfalls, and we had this. Don't say things that just blatantly trigger certain outcomes. And we had this for nano earlier, where some people out of UK labs were very excited about now being able to play God. It's like, we can create things that don't exist in nature. That is very exciting for you, I have no doubt, and it's very exciting for me, but I promise you there's a good chunk of the population who doesn't find that quite as exciting. And maybe there's a way of describing that differently. So I think that's one. And then I think the other one, and this has worked really well for the National Nanotech Initiative, where we built collaborations between scientists and social scientists. And I think what we're doing here in MIR and the building more broadly, with Laura, with a whole bunch of other people. What all of our grants are with DOE, or with NSF, with colleagues in engineering and nuclear engineering, in genetics, wherever else. So working together to basically figure out, can we move ahead in a way where we communicate and develop science at the same time? So do the science of communicating and the science of genetics at the same time in a way that really allows us to have the conversations, those public conversations that are necessary. And Alan Leshner, the former CEO of AAA, said it, I think, quite nicely, that we're not going to move ahead with new technologies unless we have this honest, bidirectional dialogue that talks about the perils and the pitfalls as well as the promise. And I think in order to do that, I think interdisciplinary endeavors like everything that's happening in this building are really key. How about that for a closing statement? Thank you very much.